So today in class you learned how to add and subtract numbers written in both scientific notation and standard form. Tonight's quick video is how to multiply and divide, which surprisingly is quite a bit easier than adding and subtracting with scientific notation. So let's get started, but quick review, we're going to be checking a lot of our work in the calculator. So I want us to understand exactly how you read scientific notation in a calculator. A lot of you guys have asked, what does that E in my calculator stand for? So if you want to write somewhere in your notes before we get started that your E is just your power of 10. 10 to some power, or times 10 to that power. So for example, if you saw in your calculator 5E5, that simply means 5 times 10, there's your E to the 5th power. So let's practice looking at these and seeing what they would look like in scientific notation, because you never want to write E in your answer. You want to write it as a coefficient times a power of 10. So again, that E just stands for that multiplying by a power of 10. So if you saw 1 in 75/100 E negative 6, that would be the same as 1 in 75/100 times 10 to the power of negative 6. Again, write this somewhere so you don't forget. You never want to just write an E in your on your answer. All right, if we had 9 and 909 thousandths, E12, that would be the same as 9 and 909 thousandths times 10 to the power of 12. So again, that E just represents multiplying by that power of 10. So now that you know what you should expect in your calculator, let's get started. All right, so we're going to cover multiplying and dividing today. The nice thing is we're just multiplying and dividing using our exponent rules. So it's pretty simple. Your notes don't have a lot to fill in, but make sure you watch this video so you can get the full explanation. So I have over to the right some questions that might signal multiplication. They're very similar to questions that might signal addition, so you definitely want to use your critical thinking there. But you're going to see a lot of word problems that want you to decide what operation to use. So if you see a word problem and it says how many total, for example, when we learned there were 100 billion stars in our galaxy, 400 billion galaxies, how many total stars you multiplied. All right, or how much altogether. Those are things that tell you you're multiplying. So you're just going to rearrange your multiplication sentence, your scientific notation expressions, and to multiply the coefficients together and multiply the powers of 10 together. So let's see what that looks like. It says multiply the coefficients together. So here's my example sentence. 2.5 times 10 to the 9th power multiplied by 2 2/10 times 10 to the 3rd power. We're just going to multiply the coefficients together. So 2.5 times 2 2/10, and then we're going to multiply our powers of 10 together. That's the second step. So 2.5 times 2 2/10 is 5.5. And then this is where your exponent rules come in. If I'm multiplying these powers of 10, that's the same thing as just adding the exponents. So you might want to write that over to the side. I'm not multiplying 9 and 3, I'm multiplying the powers of 10, which means I just add the exponents. So multiplying those powers of 10, you get 10 to the 12th power, and you have those two parts combined to make your scientific notation expression. So the product of these two statements is 5.5 times 10 to the 12th power. And if you typed it in your calculator, you'd probably see 5.5 E12. So maybe write that below your notes just so you know what that would look like in a calculator. So we're going to practice in a second, but we'll cover dividing next. So take a second, process that. So when you're multiplying scientific notation expressions, you're going to multiply the coefficients together, multiply the powers of 10 together, which means use your exponent rule, your product rule, and then you combine them to meet your final sentence. Now sometimes this coefficient is not between 1 and 10, and that's when you'll have to do a little fixing, which you'll see in a little bit. So let's go to division. Division is quite the same. Instead of multiplying the coefficients, you're going to divide your coefficients, and then you're going to divide your powers of 10 using the quotient rule. Really quickly, I want you to highlight or circle this question because it has an entire I can statement dedicated to that. So you have an I can statement that says, I can find out how many times greater one value is than another. And so that how many times greater question signals division. How much more would signal subtraction, but how many times as much or how many times greater is division. So let's look at dividing these two scientific notation expressions. 5 times 10 to the 9th divided by 2.5 times 10 cubed. So I'm not going to divide those all at once. I'm going to separate them. We have 5 divided by 2.5, which is 2. 10 to the 9th power divided by 10 cubed. If you need to write, that's your quotient rule. You're going to subtract. And then you have your final statement at the end. That would be 2 times 10 to the 6th power. Now you can always try these in your calculator like we talked about today. You just want to make sure that you put both scientific notation expressions in parentheses with that division sign in the middle, or both of them in the numerator and denominator of a fraction. So it's imperative that you use parentheses when you're trying to use your calculator. All right, so that was all the instruction for multiplying and dividing. Let's go to practice problems at the bottom of your page. All right, so we're multiplying these two expressions. We're going to rearrange the sentences because multiplication, you can rearrange the order in which you multiply. So I'm going to multiply the coefficients first. So 5 and 2/10 times 3. And I'm going to multiply the powers of 10 next. 10 to the 30th power times 10 to the 30th power. All right, when I do 5 and 2/10 times 3, I get 15 and 6/10. And when I multiply these powers of 10, it's the product rule, so I just add the exponent. So 10 to the 60th power. If you notice your hint, it says make sure your final answer is written in scientific notation correctly. There's a problem with this coefficient. We talked about this earlier this week. If it's not between 1 and 10, you have to rewrite it. And remember, we're balancing. What you do to one side, you must do the opposite to the other to maintain the same value. So if we change the place value to be 1 less, I'm going to put a little -1 in our coefficient, we have to add 1 to our exponent to show that place value increasing in that part of the expression. So we need to go 1 less because 1.56 is greater than or equal to 1 and less than 10. So I'm going to rewrite it. 1 and 56/100 times 10 now to the 61st power. And when you have something crazy like that, I would definitely encourage you to type this in your calculator and double check your work. So if you typed all this in your calculator with those parentheses, and you could type this first part in, you wouldn't have to rearrange it in your calculator. You would get something like 1.56 e to the 61st power. All right, another practice problem. Now let's look at division. So again, you're going to divide those coefficients. So I'm going to do 1 and 2/10 divided by 4 times 10 to the 6th power divided by 10 to the 4th power. All right, 1 and 2/10 divided by 4 would be 3/10. Paying attention to that coefficient, we're going to have to fix that later. Times 10 to the 6 minus 4, that quotient rule, 10 to the 2nd power. All right, and just like that multiplication example, we've got to rewrite this coefficient between 1 and 10. Unlike this one, we're actually going to get 1 bigger in our place value, so we're going to do +1. That means we want to take away 1 from the exponent, so doing the opposites. So that's the same as 3 times 10 to the 1st power. That's a very small statement, so you could just say or 30. If you type this in your calculator, you would not see an E because the digits are so small, it would just be a 30. All right, we're going to do a couple more example problems. Make sure you write these to the side or on the back of your notes. You definitely want to include them in your work. All right, so let's try division. So number 1, pause it, take a second to write this down, and then let's try it. All right, we have 10 times 10 to the 20th power divided by 2.5 times 10 to the 18th power. We can separate this out. We can do 10 divided by 2.5, and I'm just going to show you it written in a little bit of different way, times 10 to the 20th power divided by 10 to the 18th power. All right, 10 divided by 2.5 would be 4. And 10 to the 20th power divided by 10 to the 18th power, we'd use the quotient rule and we'd subtract our exponents and get 10 to the 2nd power. All right, there's your division sentence. Pause it, write that down, and let's try this multiplication. All right, we want to rewrite it with our coefficients being multiplied together. So we're going to have 3 and 25/100 times 4, and then 10 cubed times 10 to the 4th power. All right. So 3 25/100 times 4 would give us 13. And our product rule, we'd add these exponents to get 10 to the power of 7. Now, if you notice, I can't leave it like that because that 13 is greater than 10. My decimal would be here, so I'm going to make my place value 1 smaller in the coefficient, which means my exponent needs to get 1 larger. Now, I can write 1 3/10 times 10 to the 8th power. All right, and again, if you type this in your calculator, as long as you type those parentheses in, then you will be able to get the correct answer as well. Just make sure you understand the process. All right, pause it, make sure you get that. One last thing I want to talk about is your standards, your I can statement, specifically says you should be able to perform operations when you're given both a number written in scientific notation and a number written in standard form. And all that requires is that you rewrite one of them in the other form. A lot of times it's easier to rewrite one in scientific notation because sometimes these numbers can get quite large. So let's try it really quickly. Let's do 7 5/10 times 10 to the 5th power. And we're going to actually divide it. We're going to rewrite this in scientific notation. And it would be 1.5 times 10. Let's double check. 1, 2, 3, 4 to the 4th power. Now I can rearrange my division sentence to divide my coefficients and divide my powers of 10 because now I do have a coefficient and a power of 10. All right, so I have 7.5 divided by 1.5. Multiplied by 10 to the 5th power, divided by 10 to the 4th power. All right, now I'm going to divide. 7.5 divided by 1.5 gives us 5. And we're going to multiply that by a power of 10. We're dividing. Quotient rule means subtract. So 5 times 10 to the 1st power, or I can just say 50. We'll do a lot of practice in class. Just always remember, if you are doing it by hand without a calculator or not using your calculator just yet, you must rewrite one of them so that they're both in the same form, either both in scientific notation or both in standard form. And make sure you always double check with your calculator. All right, you're done.